There are people in this world so brilliantly alive that you never stop to wonder what it costs them. Robin Williams was one of those people. You saw the energy, you heard the laughter, you felt the warmth radiating from him like something inexhaustible. Audiences around the world gave him their attention, and he returned it multiplied, a human kaleidoscope, spinning through voices and characters and emotions faster than the mind could follow. He was, by almost every measure, one of the most gifted performers who ever lived. But there was something that almost no one ever asked about Robin Williams. Not the journalists, not the talk show hosts, not the biographers who cataloged his films and his awards and his legendary improvisations. No one ever really asked what happened after the lights went down, what it felt like to be that funny, that fast, that endlessly giving, and then to walk off stage and face the silence alone. This is not the story of Robin Williams the legend. This is the story of Robin Williams the man. And it begins not on a Hollywood set or a sold-out stage, but in a small, smoky comedy club in San Francisco in the late 1970s, on a night that almost no one recorded, that almost no one wrote down, but that the people who witnessed it would carry with them for the rest of their lives. But to understand that night, you have to go back further to the boy who first discovered that making people laugh was the only reliable way to make people stay. He was born in Chicago in 1951, the son of a Ford Motor Company executive and a former model. The Williams household was large, comfortable, and extraordinarily quiet. His father, Robert, was formal and reserved, not cold, but distant in the way that men of his generation were trained to be. His mother, Laurie, had a wit that flickered through her like a flame, and Robin inherited it completely. But wit, in a house that big and that quiet, is a strange gift to carry. It looks for walls to bounce off of. Robin was largely raised by household staff. His parents traveled frequently. The home in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan was vast, 16 rooms, manicured grounds, and Robin spent long stretches of it, essentially alone, filling the silence with voices, imaginary characters. Soldiers, generals, comedians. He would lose himself for hours, performing for no one, building a world inside his head that was louder and more colorful than the one outside his door. He was not unhappy, exactly, but he was lonely in a particular way that children of absent parents often are: not neglected, not unloved, but unseen. And the difference between those things is everything. When Robin was a teenager, the family moved to Marin County, California, and something changed. He found theater. He found that when he performed, people did not merely tolerate him, they leaned toward him. They lit up. They stopped whatever they were doing and simply watched. For a boy who had spent years performing for empty rooms, that feeling was overwhelming. It was also, from the very beginning, something he could not entirely trust, because the moment the performance ended, the attention ended with it. And the question that would follow Robin Williams for the rest of his life first formed somewhere in those teenage years. Was any of it real? Did they love him, or did they love what he could do? He had no answer. So he kept performing. He arrived at the Juilliard School in New York City in 1973, one of only 20 students accepted into the drama division that year. His classmate was Christopher Reeve, a man who would become one of his closest friends, a friendship that would outlast fame and crisis and loss, in ways neither of them could have imagined. Juilliard was rigorous, classical, demanding. Robin's gift was not structure, it was chaos, brilliant and controlled chaos. The ability to move between emotional registers so quickly that audiences barely registered the shift before he had already moved on. His teachers recognized the talent immediately. They also recognized it could not be fully contained within a classical framework. He left Juilliard after 2 years and headed west. Not because he had failed, but because the stage that was waiting for him was not the kind you studied for. San Francisco in the mid-1970s was electric. The comedy scene was alive, improvisational, raw, willing to go anywhere. The clubs were small and loud and smelled of cigarette smoke. The audiences were smart and unforgiving. You either held the room or you lost it. Robin Williams held every room he ever entered. He began performing at the intersection, then at the Holy City Zoo, then anywhere that would have him. He performed multiple sets a night, sometimes driving across the city between clubs to squeeze in another appearance. He was not doing it for money. He was doing it because performing was the only time the noise in his head organized itself into something useful, the only time the loneliness transformed into connection. What the audiences saw was a force of nature. What he was actually doing was something more intimate. He was listening. Robin Williams was one of the most attentive performers who ever lived. He watched the room constantly, reading individual faces the way a musician reads sheet music. He saw who was laughing and who was holding back, who looked tired, who looked lost, who had come in wearing a smile that did not quite reach their eyes. And sometimes he would stop mid-routine, mid-improvisation, and address someone directly, not to mock them, not to make them the punchline, but simply because he had seen something real in their face, and the performance suddenly felt less important than the person. That instinct would define him his entire career, but it had never been tested quite the way it was tested on one particular night in 1978. And what happened that night was something no one in the room ever forgot. It was a Wednesday, mid-November, the kind of San Francisco evening that arrives cold and fog-wrapped when the city feels like it is pulling inward. The club was called the Punchline, one of the smaller rooms on the circuit, with maybe 80 seats and a stage barely large enough for a stool and a microphone. Robin was filling in for someone who had canceled. He arrived early and stood at the back watching the crowd filter in. Most of the audience was exactly what you would expect. Young, casually dressed, looking for a good time on a midweek night. And then there was the man in the third row. Robin noticed him almost immediately. The man was perhaps 50 years old, with the kind of stillness that stands out in a room full of movement. He was alone. He was dressed carefully, the way people dressed when they wanted to appear composed, regardless of how they felt. He had ordered a drink, but had not touched it. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, and he was looking at the stage with an expression Robin would later describe as the face of someone who has run out of road. His name was Daniel Coulter. He was a high school music teacher from Sacramento. 3 days earlier, he had buried his wife of 22 years. Robin did not know any of this yet. He only knew what he saw. A man in a room full of people who was, in some essential way, entirely alone. The show began. Robin took the stage and opened fast, throwing voices and observations and impressions at the room in rapid succession, warming the air, loosening the audience. The room came alive quickly. People were laughing hard within the first few minutes. Robin was in full flight, moving around the stage, inhabiting characters, building rhythms and breaking them. And then his eyes landed on Daniel Coulter. The man had not laughed once, not a smile, not a flicker of amusement. He was watching Robin perform with the careful attention of someone who had come to the theater not to escape but simply to be somewhere, to be in a room with other human beings, because the alternative, going home to the silence, was something he could no longer face. Something shifted in Robin Williams in that moment. Internally, the performance recalibrated. He kept going for another few minutes, kept the room warm, kept the laughter moving. But every minute or so, his eyes returned to Daniel Coulter, the untouched drink, the folded hands, the face that held everything in. And then Robin Williams did something that almost no comedian would ever have done. He stopped the show. Not dramatically, not with a grand announcement. He simply slowed down, let the current bit resolve itself, and stepped to the front of the stage. "Hey," he said. His voice had changed. The performance energy was still there, but underneath it, something quieter had surfaced, something warmer, more direct. "I see a lot of people in here tonight who are having a good time, and I'm really glad about that." He paused, "and I see one person who came here for a different reason." The room did not know what to do with that. A few people laughed nervously. Robin did not. "Sir," he said, looking directly at Daniel Coulter, I don't know your name, but I see you. And I just want you to know, it's okay. Whatever brought you here tonight, it's okay. Daniel Coulter looked up slowly from the table. His expression was the expression of a man who had not expected to be seen, had not wanted to be seen, and was now suddenly, unavoidably visible. You don't have to laugh, Robin said quietly. You don't have to do anything. I'm just glad you're here. The room was very still. And then, Robin Williams sat down on the edge of the stage, legs dangling, and for the next 5 minutes, 5 unscripted, unrehearsed, unrecorded minutes, he spoke, not as a comedian, but simply as a man talking to another man in a room. He did not ask Daniel what was wrong. He did not make it a routine. He talked about his own loneliness, the real kind, not the performed kind. About what it felt like to be in a room full of people and still feel completely unreachable. About the nights in San Francisco when he had walked home from a club at 2 in the morning, the laughter still ringing in his ears, and felt the silence of his apartment like a physical weight. Grief is the loneliest thing there is, Robin said at one point. He had not been told anything about Daniel's wife. He was simply following something he could see in a man's face. Because everyone around you is still moving, and you're standing still, and you wonder, ticking, if you'll ever move again. Daniel Coulter's composure finally broke. It was quiet, just a breath that changed, a hand that came up to cover his eyes, a slight forward curve of the shoulders. But everyone in the room saw it, and something remarkable happened. No one laughed, no one made a sound. 80 people in a comedy club on a Wednesday night simply sat in the presence of someone else's grief, held there by a 26-year-old comedian who had decided that the performance could wait. When Daniel Coulter looked up again, Robin was still watching him, not with pity, with something closer to recognition. You came here, Robin said simply. That was brave. Then he stood, picked up the microphone, and returned to the comedy. The transition was seamless, a natural exhale, the room releasing its held breath and leaning back into laughter. He performed for another 45 minutes, and it was one of the best sets anyone in that room had ever witnessed. The laughter was different now. It had weight to it, the particular warmth of an audience that had been trusted with something real. After the show, as people filed out, Daniel Coulter waited. He had no plan, no prepared thing to say. He simply waited near the edge of the bar as the room emptied, turning his untouched drink slowly in his hands. Robin came out from backstage and saw him standing there. He walked over without hesitation and sat down beside him. They talked for 2 hours. Robin learned about Margaret Coulter, about the 22 years, about the classroom where Daniel had taught music for 3 decades, about the way Margaret used to sit in the back row of his school performances and signal him with a tiny nod when he was about to lose the kids' attention. About the 3 days since the funeral that had felt, Daniel said, like walking through water. Robin did not tell Daniel everything would be fine. He did not offer solutions or timelines or reassurances. He listened. And occasionally, gently, he made Daniel laugh, not with a punchline, but with the particular tenderness of a person who knows how to find warmth in a moment without forcing it. When Daniel finally stood to leave, he shook Robin's hand and then could not seem to let go of it. I don't know why I came here tonight, he said. Robin looked at him for a moment. I think you do, he said. You came because you needed to be somewhere with people, because you weren't ready to be alone yet. And that's not weakness. That's the most human thing there is. Robin Williams never mentioned that night publicly. There was no record of it. No interview, no anecdote, no carefully placed story. It was not the kind of thing Robin talked about, because it was not the kind of thing he did for an audience. But that night was not an exception in Robin Williams' life. It was the pattern. It was who he was. By 1978, the same year he sat beside Daniel Coulter at the Punchline, he had landed the role of Mork on Happy Days, which spun off into the phenomenon of Mork and Mindy. The fame that followed was enormous and immediate. By 1979, Robin Williams was one of the most recognizable faces in America. His stand-up specials were events. He was on magazine covers. He was doing sold-out tours. But the applause, when it ended, ended completely, and the silence that replaced it was the same silence it had always been. Fame does not fill that particular kind of emptiness. The loneliness Robin Williams carried was not the loneliness of obscurity. It was something older, formed in the quiet rooms of a large house in Michigan, and no number of laughing strangers could fully reach it. His friends from those years describe a man of remarkable contrasts, incandescent in company, genuinely difficult to reach in the quiet moments between. Christopher Reeve, who knew Robin as well as anyone, said that Robin could be the most alive person in any room and simultaneously the loneliest. That those two things existed in him not as contradictions but as complements. The aliveness was partly for the loneliness, a way of insisting on connection, even when connection felt impossible. The film career that followed tells the most truthful story about who Robin Williams was. He was drawn, again and again, to characters who were broken and generous in equal measure. Adrian Cronauer in Good Morning, Vietnam, cracking jokes over the airwaves for soldiers who needed to remember what laughter felt like. John Keating in Dead Poets Society, pouring a lifetime of passion into students, just beginning to understand that their lives were their own to claim. Sean Maguire in Good Will Hunting, the therapist who could only reach a brilliant, damaged young man by being willing to reveal his own damage first. It's not your fault. The scene. The moment. Robin Williams did not act that scene. He inhabited it so completely that Matt Damon has said he did not know what was happening, that what the camera captured was not performance, but actual human contact. That was the gift, and it was also the cost. Because to give that fully, you have to actually feel it, and feeling it, all of it, every time takes something from a person that does not replenish easily. What the audience experienced as magic, Robin Williams was experiencing as necessity. He had to reach people, not for applause, but because connection was the only thing that quieted the silence. And the more he gave, the more the silence demanded in return. He passed away in August of 2014. He was 63 years old. The world responded with a grief that was immediate and enormous and, for many people, surprising in its intensity. Not surprising that Robin Williams had died, but surprising in the depth of what people felt. Strangers wept publicly. The response was not merely the loss of a celebrity, but the loss of something people had been unable to articulate until it was gone. What was that thing? It was not the movies. Exactly. It was not the stand-up, or the awards, or the cultural moments. Those were the containers. What was inside the containers was something simpler and rarer. The experience of being paid attention to, of being seen. Robin Williams had spent his entire career doing for audiences what he had done for Daniel Coulter in a San Francisco comedy club in 1978. He had looked out from wherever he was standing and tried to find the person in the room who needed to be acknowledged. And when he found them, he stopped the routine, stopped the performance, stopped the forward motion of his own ambition, and he simply showed up for them. Daniel Coulter lived until he was 79 years old. He taught music in Sacramento for 12 more years after that night at the Punchline. He talked about Robin Williams often, not about the movies, not about the famous routines. He talked about a Wednesday night in November 1978, when a young comedian had looked at him across a dark room and decided that what was in his face mattered more than what was on the stage. He didn't know me, Daniel used to say. He had no reason to stop, but he stopped. He paused whenever he said this, the way people pause before the most important thing. He stopped because he was paying attention, and paying attention is the most generous thing one human being can do for another. Robin Williams gave the world laughter. He gave it wildly, generously, in quantities that seem impossible to have come from a single human life. But the thing Robin Williams gave that lasted longest, that traveled farthest, that mattered most, was attention. Real attention, the kind that costs something to give, the kind that requires you to stop what you are doing and look at another person and acknowledge that their interior life is as real and as complicated and as important as your own. He gave that to Daniel Coulter in a San Francisco comedy club on a Wednesday night in November 1978, with no camera rolling and no one taking notes. And the reason people wept for Robin Williams the way they did, with the intimacy of loss, with the specific grief of someone lost from your own life, is because somewhere, at some point, directly or indirectly, Robin Williams had stopped for them. He had looked at them across the dark, and he had seen them. That is the story that almost no one recorded, and that almost no one can stop telling. The night Robin Williams stopped the show, not because anything had gone wrong, but because he looked out into the dark and found the one person who needed him most, and stopped. The world is full of rooms where people sit alone in a crowd. Most performers walk past. Robin Williams walked toward,